Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
David Bennett always had the feeling that his life was a book written by other hands. Since he was young, he felt out of place in Millstone Bay, as if he had never belonged to the place where he was born and built his family. The streets of the city seemed too narrow for his thoughts, and the familiar faces no longer brought any warmth. Deep down, he believed the problem lay in how he had raised his children. During Grace and Eric's childhood, he dedicated himself to giving them everything he could. Every gift, every trip, every treat was his way of compensating for what he couldn't express in words. Only later did he realize that by trying to fill the silence with material goods, he had, without noticing, built an invisible wall between him and the kids. When the two reached adolescence, that gap became glaring. Conversations became short, glances avoided, and responses always came loaded with boredom or disdain. David tried to hide the discomfort, but inside, it felt like he was a stranger in his own home. Hannah, his wife, was always the opposite. She knew exactly how to keep the children close. She had an intense bond with Grace, which, in David's eyes, was more than just mother-daughter complicity. It was almost as if Hannah and Grace formed a team he was never invited to join. Eric, on the other hand, floated between both sides, seeking his own space. When Grace and Eric finished high school, David saw a chance to start over. He proposed moving to Clearwater Springs, hoping that a new place would erase the weariness of the past. He imagined that in a different setting, he could regain the lost dialogue and reverse the years of distance. He sincerely believed that the gap between him and his children was a result of the exhausting routine and monotony of the town where everyone seemed to know too much about each other. However, reality was merciless. The move didn't bring any renewal. On the contrary, the marriage, which already showed signs of strain, began to crumble completely. Hannah seemed increasingly absent. The children, now adults, went on with their lives, and David was left with what remained, a cold and silent house, where even the objects seemed to be witnesses to his failure. The emptiness settled in permanently. David was downtown, sitting in a small cafe where he usually spent his afternoons, with his cell phone on the table and a now-cold cup of coffee beside him. It was his daily refuge, a place where no one bothered him and where he could immerse himself in his silent readings. It was during this repetitive and lonely cycle that an unexpected phone call changed everything. Grace called, her voice trembling, saying that Hannah had fallen at home and fractured her ankle. The news, by itself, caused immediate discomfort. However, something in the way she spoke aroused David's suspicion. He asked where Hannah was. Grace replied that she was at the hospital. Without delay, he wanted to know if she was the one who took their mother there. Grace hesitated, stuttered, stumbled over her words, until, with difficulty, she said she didn't know how her mother had gotten to the hospital. That answer had an immediate impact. David felt as if everything around him had been suspended for a moment. What had once been just a vague uneasiness turned into an uncomfortable certainty that there was something much bigger behind this situation. Without wasting time, he called Eric. His son, surprised, said he didn't know anything, that no one had told him anything. David's unease grew quickly. Without thinking of excuses or justifications, he immediately headed to the hospital, feeling his blood boil with every mile. He needed to look Hannah in the eye and get the truth out of her, the truth that everyone seemed to be hiding. When he arrived, the scene he found was worse than he had imagined. Hannah, seated with her ankle immobilized, seemed more concerned with avoiding his gaze than with her own pain. When he asked how she had gotten there, she only muttered that she had called a taxi. The response came dry, rehearsed, and full of nervousness that was impossible to disguise. David realized at that moment that he was surrounded by lies. Even though she tried to maintain the charade, Hannah got lost in her own words, unable to sustain the improvised version she was telling. Each sentence she uttered only made the situation more uncomfortable, as if she were digging herself deeper and deeper into a hole. The taxi excuse sounded too weak for someone who had known her for so many years. David didn't press further. He knew any question at that moment would be futile. He simply observed in silence, his gaze fixed on her, as if he already understood everything but was waiting for the right moment to act. When the doctor released Hannah, he got up, accompanied her to the exit, and the two left the hospital side by side, without exchanging a single word. The silence between them was heavier than any argument. Inside the car, his eyes fixed on the road, David broke the silence abruptly, without beating around the bush, asking what had been on his mind since the hospital. He slightly turned his face and, without changing his tone, shot, "Why didn't you call me instead of taking a taxi?" Hannah hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't come, until she mumbled something about not wanting to bother him, but the excuse sounded too empty to convince. David couldn't sleep that night. He stayed seated in the living room, staring into the void, his mind consumed by doubts and certainties that mixed mercilessly. The memory of Hannah's flustered face at the hospital haunted him every moment. There was something hidden, something much deeper than a simple household accident. It was as if time was finally playing all its cards, forcing him to see what he had avoided for so long. In the early hours of the morning, when silence still dominated the house, he picked up the phone and decided to call Eric. He needed to hear from his son some words that might, at least, organize that whirlwind. Eric answered with a tired voice, as if he already knew the reason for the call. David went straight to the point, without beating around the bush, asking him to come to his house. The response came in a resigned tone, as if the son was already prepared for what was coming. A short while later, Eric arrived, carrying an expression on his face that was hard to decipher. The two went out for a walk, as if they needed a neutral place for that heavy conversation. They walked side by side through the quiet streets, without hurry. When they reached a more secluded stretch, David stopped and faced his son. He didn't need to say anything. He just kept his gaze steady, waiting for Eric to spill everything at once, without circumlocutions, as if that moment had been stored away for years, waiting for the right time to explode. Eric took a deep breath and began to speak, as if the words weighed more than he could bear. He said that he and Grace had kept a secret for years, a secret that started back when they lived in Millstone Bay. He recounted that during their teenage years, he and his sister discovered that Hannah was having a relationship with Mark Ellison, an old family friend. They didn't know how to react at the time. They were too young to understand all the consequences, but mature enough to know that it was wrong. The shock of seeing their mother with another man stayed with them like a wound that never healed. As Eric spoke, David felt each word like a blow. The details came loaded with resentment and bitterness. His son recounted that they had seen with their own eyes, more than once, encounters between Hannah and Mark, always in secret, during times when David believed the family routine was proceeding normally. According to Eric, Grace had confronted their mother at the time, demanding an explanation. Hannah's response was cruel. She said, coldly, that David no longer satisfied her, that the marriage was a burden, and that Mark was the escape valve that allowed her to feel alive again. She revealed that all of this was her choice, something she did willingly, without regret. David remained silent, his gaze fixed on his son, but his body taken over by a strange sensation, as if he were floating outside himself. The image he had always had of his wife was shattered brutally, and the pieces of the puzzle finally began to fit together. The distances, the cold looks, the sudden disinterest in family matters, it all made sense. The betrayal wasn't recent, nor fleeting. It was deeply embedded in the family's past, like a crack that had slowly grown until it opened an irreparable hole. Eric continued, explaining that after that discovery, he and Grace made a pact of silence. Both were afraid of destroying the family structure, of causing a rupture that could swallow them all. They chose to carry the secret in silence, each dealing with the weight of that truth in their own way. They said they had tried, for a while, to ignore what they knew, but it corroded every relationship within the house. The arguments increased, absences became frequent, and the house, once full of laughter, turned into a scene of cold walls and empty conversations. David listened to everything with a heavy heart. Eric's voice, though firm, betrayed the exhaustion of someone who had carried the burden for too long. His son ended by saying that when they decided to leave Millstone Bay, he and Grace believed it would be a fresh start, a chance for everyone to bury the past. But Hannah never wanted to forget. She maintained contact with Mark, hidden, sustaining the relationship even after the move. According to Eric, Hannah never showed any regret, as if she considered all of this her personal right. At that moment, David felt that something inside him had died. Hannah's betrayal was a deep wound, but what hurt the most was knowing that the children had lived suffocated by such a devastating secret while he remained blind, believing that the problem was just the natural generational gap. Every family memory now seemed tainted, contaminated by lies and omissions. The silence of so many years between them was explained there, in those words laden with pain. They continued walking down the street in silence until David, in a low but firm voice, spoke what already seemed obvious. Without looking at his son, he said with a bitter tone, as if merely confirming what he already knew, "So it was Mark who was with Hannah when she got hurt. He was the one who took her to the hospital, wasn't he?" Eric took a while to respond, as if calculating each word, until he finally said, without conviction but with honesty, "I can't confirm, but, given the history, it's quite likely." David moved forward, saying nothing else, but inside he already knew that everything was clear. When he returned home, he walked through the rooms in silence, looking at every corner with an empty gaze, as if bidding farewell to that place and everything it represented. At that moment, he understood that his story there had come to an end. Nothing worth keeping remained. Everything that once was a memory now turned into a burden, and he felt, with absolute certainty, that it was time to leave, without looking back. David stayed at home for 2 more days, quiet, but not lost. His thoughts no longer ran in circles as they had before. The decision was made, and this time there was no room for hesitation. With calmness, he reviewed every bank account, every investment, every value saved throughout an entire lifetime of work. The money was there, untouched, accumulated with the same rigor he used to maintain his routine during all those years. It wasn't about revenge or punishment, it was simply the need to free himself, to sever the last thread that still tied him to that scene. Without making a fuss, he began to organize everything. He sold stocks, closed investments, cashed out funds kept for decades, and transferred amounts carefully, strategically ensuring that every movement went unnoticed by anyone who, out of curiosity or malice, might try to track his steps. The final sum of all the reserves, which he had once accumulated thinking of a peaceful retirement alongside a family that no longer existed, amounted to about $2 million. Now, that money ceased to be a future plan and became the definitive passage to a distant fresh start, where no one knew his name and where he could, finally, disappear completely. He packed only a few clothes, the bare necessities to leave without looking back, leaving Hannah the house and the car, as if returning to her the stage where all those lies had been performed for so long. He booked the ticket discreetly, for a flight to Spain, specifically to the island of Majorca. There was no elaborate plan, no itinerary. His only intention was to disappear, to vanish from everyone's memory, to start anew in a place where his name carried no weight. In the final minutes before departure, David walked through the house one last time. He looked at the kitchen, where he had pretended to be happy so many times, at the living room, which housed empty conversations, and at the bedroom, which witnessed cold nights and endless silences. No tears, no regrets, just an unshakable certainty that this chapter was closed. David waited for the right moment. When he learned that Grace had taken Hannah to the hospital to have her ankle re-evaluated, he saw the perfect opportunity. He grabbed the bag that was already packed, checked his documents, and walked out the front door, without leaving a note, message, or explanation. He left with the firm intention of never returning. He boarded with a small suitcase, containing only simple clothes, some documents, and the money. During the flight, he didn't think about Hannah, nor Grace, nor even Eric. He thought only about how vast the world was and how he had limited himself for so long to a life that he always knew was too small for what he carried inside him. As soon as he arrived in Spain, still getting used to the new time zone and the silence around him, the messages began to arrive. First came Hannah, with long texts asking where he was. Then came messages from Grace, alternating between desperation and resentment. Finally, Eric wrote, with a more restrained tone, almost as if he already understood his father's decision. David then decided to respond only to his son. Without revealing his location, he said simply that he had left forever, that he was fine, at peace, but that he didn't intend to return. He asked his son to take care of his mother and sister, making it clear that from then on, each would follow their own path. However, he made one direct request. He wanted Eric to tell Hannah that he knew everything, that the betrayal was no longer a secret, and that it was precisely because of this that he had decided to leave for good. There was no more room for pretenses or explanations. The truth, now, was exposed. He sent the message and moved on. Upon arriving in Mallorca, he rented a small, remote, and simple apartment. He bought new clothes, left his old phone behind, and adopted a local number. Every move was calculated to ensure that no one could reach him. He began to walk the streets without haste, observing the comings and goings of people, without the need to carry any past. The new routine brought something he had forgotten how it felt: peace. Over time, he came to appreciate that voluntary isolation. He began frequenting markets, small cafes, and even the square where many locals spent their afternoons chatting. Gradually, he got used to hearing another language around him, a clear sign that he was, finally, far from everything that had once imprisoned him. Months passed, and as expected, Hannah tried to make contact. First came emails, then messages sent by Grace, all with the same tone oscillating between distress and pleading. David read each word with the tranquility of someone who had already cut all ties. He ignored each attempt, one by one, as if simply closing the door on the past. None of them contained a genuine apology. All the messages revolved around discomfort, the shock of his disappearance, but never touched on the truth he carried in his chest. Time was his greatest ally. David learned, through Eric, that Hannah and Grace had tried to track him down, without success. It was as if he had evaporated. He left no traces, no clues, no loose stories. Eric was the only one with whom he kept an open channel, but always with one clear condition: never discuss his new life with the two of them. His son respected his choice, and over the years, he began visiting David in Mallorca, bringing with him only light conversations, without demands, as if both had found a kind of peace in that preserved bond. When he felt the time was right, David decided to move again, this time to the neighboring island, Menorca. He wanted an even quieter place, where he could live in absolute anonymity. He bought a small house, with a simple facade, and there built his definitive refuge. He invested the remaining money wisely, ensuring that he lacked for nothing. He created a new routine, unhurried, without unwanted memories, only with the lightness of someone who, for the first time, was living according to his own will. He never mentioned Hannah's name again, nor even thought about her. To him, she had become just a closed chapter, with no need to revisit. His marriage, though still valid on paper, no longer existed in any other aspect. He had freed himself from everything, including his own emotional bonds. The escape wasn't an act of cowardice but a planned liberation, an act of survival, a personal rescue. Every day on that island was a reminder that life always offers a chance to start over, as long as one has the courage to abandon what is already dead. David, now at peace, knew that this exile was not a punishment but a conscious choice for dignity and freedom. And there, far from everyone, he finally understood the value of living in silence, listening only to the sound of his own light conscience. The months went by, and gradually, the messages stopped. Silence took over everything, but David didn't care. He lived his new daily life in peace, far from any memory that tied him to the past. During a visit years later, Eric mentioned that Hannah had moved to the family's old house, where she now lived with Mark, her lover. The news didn't surprise him. David listened without any reaction, as if he had already known beforehand how that story would unfold. He simply listened, in silence, with the serenity of someone who no longer carried grudges. 5 years had passed since his escape. Eric came to visit his father again, bringing unexpected news this time. Mark had passed away, leaving Hannah alone, without resources to move forward. Eric explained that he and Grace were now responsible for supporting her. Their mother, now aging, unable to work or support herself, depended entirely on her children to survive. David listened to every word calmly. He, who had always had a keen eye for investments, had turned the $2 million he took with him into $4 million over these 5 years. He was a wealthier man, but above all, he was someone at peace with his conscience. Without hesitation, he told his son that he would send $2 million for him to manage, with one request: use the money to take care of his sister and mother, ensuring them a peaceful and dignified life. He made it clear that he didn't want gratitude or recognition, only that they do the right thing. Eric, moved, thanked him sincerely, knowing that this gesture spoke volumes more than any speech. Before leaving, Eric looked at his father with a mix of admiration and respect. Both knew that this moment marked a definitive closure to everything that had once tied them to the past. When Eric left, David remained seated on his porch, gazing at the horizon, a faint smile on his face. There, on that simple afternoon, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the sense of a mission accomplished. Life, with all its twists, had found a way to settle accounts, and in the end, everyone got what they deserved. David, finally, could spend the rest of his days in peace, knowing that, somehow, he had left something good behind. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.